Every year, in the middle of November, on India's eastern seaboard, the state of Orissa is witness to a fascinating ritual. In the middle of the night, hundreds of thousands of people descend to the nearest stretch of water and cast away small boats with candles burning in them. This spectacle of lights is known as the Bali Yatra and commemorates the thousands of people who were sent to the distant shores of Southeast Asia centuries ago. In the secluded highlands of northern Laos lies a site that is both mysterious and awesome. For across the hilly countryside of the Plain of Jars lie hundreds of gigantic stone vases. Little is known of the peoples who built these megalithic structures more than 2,500 years ago, and even less of their purpose. Yet among the items they contained were glass beads from India, proof that from the earliest times, and even in the remotest locations, there was commercial and cultural contact with India. It was thanks to the sea that this was possible at all. These vast areas of water, turbulent, bewildering, and with unmatched power, frightened man into divine submission, yet also blessed him with favourable winds and currents which gave the possibility of new discoveries. Indeed, this entire part of the maritime world is dominated by the unique feature known as the monsoon, which is brought about by the regular heating and cooling of the Indian subcontinent and the Tibetan plateau. This phenomenon is not only the cause of seasonal heavy rains, but also generates consistent airflows and currents, which, when understood, can be used to travel great distances in relative safety. The other geographical feature was the coastal topography. Long rivers and large river basins allowed coastal people to maintain contact with those inland. While Indian coasts are known for their shallow waters, high sedimentation, and the lack of natural harbours, thereby making the creation of permanent ports difficult, Southeast Asia is famous for its beautiful natural bays, perfect places for seafaring communities to flourish. These features converged to produce ideal conditions for the development of sea contacts between the two regions. And it is here, in the caves of Krabi in southern Thailand, that the earliest coastal peoples began their tentative explorations of the sea more than 10,000 years ago. We cannot be sure when India's coasts were first settled, but the earliest coastal communities would have been similar to this one in southern Tamil Nadu, small and entirely dependent on fishing. On the other hand, Southeast Asia was more of a maritime civilization, and many of the great seaborne migrations of Austronesian peoples into the Pacific Ocean region began here. Communities such as the Bugis of Indonesia even sailed and settled in Madagascar on the western edge of the Indian Ocean. Long before recorded history, coastal populations made simple boats, such as these dugouts, and learned to row with oars. It is likely that shipping and navigation originated in these simple activities. As understanding of the monsoon winds grew, shipping technology also evolved and became more sophisticated, thereby enabling long-distance trade. The Bugis, who now put their fantastic knowledge of boat construction at the service of wealthy clients, benefited from an abundance of teak, which is almost as strong as steel and does not corrode in salt water. It is likely that the earliest transoceanic boats in this region were made of teak, but because wood does not preserve well over time, it is difficult to establish just when the first boats began sailing between India and Southeast Asia. In fact, some of the earliest evidence of maritime contacts between the two regions is to be found thousands of miles away on the west coast of Italy. The archaeological site of Ostia, to the west of Rome, was once the Roman Empire's most flourishing port, and traces of its extensive contacts with Asia are to be found in its depictions of exotic Asian animals that its sailors and merchants discovered. Ships departing from the port of Ostia would head east to Alexandria laden with silver. This cargo would then be transferred by land to boats waiting in the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf for an onward journey to India, and then further east, perhaps all the way to China. Roman items have been found both here in Arakamedu, an ancient port on India's southwest coast, and also in Thailand. They include silver coins with which Roman traders paid for merchandise, and oil lamps, which belonged to Romans who were part of an extensive trading network known as the Emporia.
Roman trade, I think, was a singularly important factor in establishing what we know as the Emporia trade in the Indian Ocean, driven by an imperial sort of state. It was enormously successful in connecting ports of the Mediterranean with the Indian Ocean and with the Southeast Asian world. So here you have, for the first time, a genuinely global empire, largely engineered by an imperial sort of vision. One of the most important spin-offs, if you like, of Roman trade was the establishment of very important and intensive networks of trade within the subcontinent. And I think this particular network was critical in connecting major centers within the hinterland with the coast, and it is this network that later networks, which one might loosely call the Buddhist merchant migration network, plugs into and is able to use in the context of the decline of Roman trade. So when we look at the Indian merchants and Buddhists exporting both commerce and culture under, say, after the 3rd century, the 4th century, they seem to dip into the resources of the previous Roman network and then move from southeastern India primarily into Southeast Asia and establish this important circuit of communication and commerce between South Asia and Southeast Asia.
The Funan Kingdom of southern Vietnam was one of the principal end destinations of the vast Indo-Roman trading network in the east. Here, in the archaeological site of Okyol, Roman pottery as well as small metal sculptures of Hindu deities have been found. And indeed, the kingdom itself is said to have been established by Indian migrants. Over the centuries, the sea has receded from Okyol, which was once close to the coast and thus strategically located at a time when ships sailed close to the coastline. At around the time the Funan kingdom was becoming established, a revolution was sweeping across India. Its name was Buddhism. This is the countryside of the eastern Indian state of Orissa. About 2,000 years ago, a powerful kingdom called Kalinga ruled this region. It was a Buddhist kingdom with extensive trading links with Southeast Asia, which was not surprising considering the proximity of both the sea and of Asia's largest freshwater lake, Lake Chilika, which made it an ideal place for a naval civilization to flourish.
I think that this is one of the interesting aspects of maritime trade in India, which has really not been explored, and that is the possibility of looking at the coastal regions as units in themselves, The west coast is one unit, the east coast is another. So if there is trade developing, let's say from the Ganges Delta, along the coastal areas coming right down to Sri Lanka, then any area where the trade is touching the coast would become very valuable. And I think that certainly part of the reason for the conquest of Kalinga would have been to capture that trade route.
In 261 BC, the Mauryan king Ashoka captured Kalinga, but repenting the slaughter, he converted to the religion of the vanquished, Buddhism. Through his famous edicts and pillars, he proclaimed Buddhism as the state religion throughout his empire, and then decided to use Kalinga's maritime networks to promote Buddhism in the east. These Buddhist caves, north of Bombay, were once dormitories for thousands of monks. Their location, right by the sea, is further evidence that many monks were either preparing to embark on long sea voyages or had just arrived by sea, perhaps as a stopover on their way to Nalanda or Bodh Gaya.
I would say that what is interesting really, the interesting question is the degree to which religious missions, if you can call them that, went together with the traders and established their centers in places where there were trading centers. And certainly Buddhism was a very marked presence in this connection.
Buddhism today is the principal religion of mainland Southeast Asia. From Myanmar in the west to Vietnam in the east, spectacular monuments and monks clad in orange robes are an integral part of the landscape, and Buddhism remains the cornerstone of personal faith and national identity of many Southeast Asian countries. This panel depicts the mythical arrival into Thailand of preachers sent by the Buddha himself. However, it is more likely that waves of Buddhist emissaries came from India and Sri Lanka from different religious orders at various periods of history. And it is in Thailand that Buddhism met with some of its earliest successes, when it became adopted by kings to confer additional legitimacy on themselves. The kingdom of Dvaravati, which covered much of central Thailand between the 5th and 10th centuries AD, remains one of the finest examples of the early implantation of Buddhism as a state religion. There is still debate over whether Dvaravati was actually a centralized kingdom or a loose federation of independent states, but it marked the advent of urban civilization in Thailand, based on both rapid urban construction and on a unified religion. Such was the success of Buddhism in Southeast Asia in the millennium that followed the Buddha's death, that kings in the region vied with each other to support the new faith in their homeland. Early stone inscriptions point to the key role played by Buddhism, not only in bringing a new faith to the region, but in giving its peoples a vital tool for keeping records and communicating with each other. That new tool was writing. This stone inscription in central Vietnam dates back to the 2nd century AD. It is one of the oldest surviving inscriptions of its kind and attests to the early arrival of Indian writing into the region. These circular letters that once marked old parchments and stone tablets today brighten up street signs, billboards and posters, and they are a direct consequence of maritime exchanges with India. Most scripts came with the arrival of Buddhist monks using the Indian Pallava script. However, since this was introduced into different parts of Southeast Asia at different moments in history, today the region boasts a variety of distinct alphabets.
Clearly the first alphabets are Indian origins, there's no doubt about that. There's no Southeast Asian alphabets. The language at the beginning is Sanskrit, and it carries a lot of the cultural background with the language. The references are Indian. But very soon, as early as the 7th century, the Indian scripts are used for local languages. Malay, Srivijaya, you have no Sanskrit inscriptions, they're all Malay inscriptions. They only come later, the Sanskrit ones. In Cambodia, they appear in the 8th century, Khmer inscriptions, you've got Cham inscriptions in Vietnam, etc., written in Indian script. So this is, we know that these languages, of course, were used locally.
Many monks today not only continue to study their own scripts, but also to learn the ancient Indian languages of Pali and Sanskrit, in which many Buddhist texts were originally written. For them, India represents a rich repository of scholastic traditions, and many of their textbooks continue to come from India. But while faith and writing are essential components of Southeast Asian identity, what strikes the visitor most are the grand monuments that Buddhism inspired. The vast temples of worship that reach up to the sky, the large stone sculptures representing the body of the Buddha, and the delicate, cloth-covered stupas hinting at the fragility of life itself are all architectural wonders. The monumental scale of Ayutthaya in Thailand is a perfect example of how kings conferred legitimacy on themselves by building grand Buddhist edifices that at once awed and humbled their subjects. In the eyes of ordinary people, their kings were not just rulers, they were custodians of the faith. Perhaps the culmination of Buddhist architectural splendour is to be found in the centre of the island of Java in Indonesia, for it is here, in a landscape of fuming volcanoes, that the Buddhist Shailendra kingdom, close allies and relatives of the larger Srivijaya kingdom, built this vast monument to the Buddha. Borobudur, the largest Buddhist monument on earth, was constructed between the 8th and 9th centuries AD as the physical representation of Buddhist cosmology. This edifice of 2 million stone blocks is built on 3 levels, each representing the evolution of human consciousness from the world of desire to the world of forms, and finally to the world of formlessness. With its many panels depicting the life of the Buddha, it seems like a gigantic textbook meant to instruct people on the means to enlightenment. Some of its panels even depict how the faith arrived in the Indonesian islands by sea from India. Although many of the statues have, over the centuries, gone missing or become damaged, Borobudur has lost none of its splendour and remains one of the most visited destinations on earth. If the construction of Borobudur had at all been possible, its Javanese builders had to thank their wealthier and more powerful relatives and allies, the rulers of the neighbouring Srivijaya Empire. The Srivijayan kingdom emerged as the Roman trading emporia declined, when intra-Asian trade began to grow. Its control of the Straits of Malacca, a vital shipping corridor, meant that it could levy taxes on virtually all the maritime commerce of Southeast Asia and became enormously wealthy as a result. Its rule has left very few material remains. What we do have, however, is a series of Buddhist temple complexes built by the Srivijayans, which would house thousands of Buddhist students. They spent years studying Sanskrit here before proceeding to Nalanda in India, and their journeys were often financed by traders. When the earliest Indian Buddhist monks reached Southeast Asia, they likely came across markets very much like this one, teeming with people and a variety of natural products and handicrafts which would have astounded the visitors. For traders accompanying the monks, it was apparent that goods could be procured here to be sold back in India, but that these were also markets for Indian products. After the decline of the Roman Empire, Indian merchants had to take their own initiative to find gold. For this, they turned to Arab boats, which were much larger, more stable, and capable of long-distance voyages across the high seas. The techniques of Arab boat building were simple and efficient. The boats, with ends pointed at both bow and stern, were built by placing and fastening horizontal planks to the keel, as well as to each other, by means of stitching. Although nails have now replaced stitches, this technique continues to be used along India's coasts, as in this yard in Kerala. In the early centuries of the Christian era, it was particularly eastern India which became the main hub for this growing trade, with the development of major ports on the east coast. Today, little exists to indicate the magnitude of the shipping activities, and it is hard to imagine that Indonesian outriggers, Arab dhows, and Chinese junks all stopped here to offload their cargo and replenish themselves. Yet there are always little signs of cultural contacts. The Parasurameshwar temple in Bhubaneswar in Orissa has a relief of an Indonesian with his distinctive headgear and his traditional dagger called the kris. There are more depictions of goods being shipped from Southeast Asia. Archaeological discoveries, including Indonesian terracotta and Chinese porcelain, also indicate that by the middle of the 6th century AD, a network of trading routes had been established linking India to various parts of Southeast Asia by sea. A large portion of the goods traded, however, were perishable items from Southeast Asia's forests. The aloe that grew here was much in demand back home by Ayurvedic specialists, whereas ling lang was used to make incense, and cinnamon was used as an expensive condiment by wealthy Indians. Equally sought after were the brilliant red seeds of the saga tree, which were used as standard weight by merchants throughout the Indian Ocean region. Indian traders also discovered that many of the region's spices and herbs were being used to treat ordinary health problems. It is more than likely that ingredients from Southeast Asia's traditional medicine were sent back to India and eventually became incorporated into India's own traditional system of medicine, Ayurveda. On its side, India exported luxury products, and none sold better than ivory. Today, in order to protect elephants, the ivory trade is highly regulated. Yet a few licensed ivory workers continue to perform an art that is almost as old as trade itself. Over the centuries, of all the products to be exchanged between India and Southeast Asia, one would come to define the very staple of commerce: textiles. From the Red Sea to the Spice Islands, Indian textiles clothed entire populations. Indian weavers had long been able to sell their brightly coloured, richly patterned textiles to both the East and the West. Textiles from Gujarat, known as patolas and calicos, with their intricately woven designs, were particularly prized by Southeast Asian elites, who were known to have paid for these goods in gold. It is said that Gujarati cloth merchants, who would successfully return from Java, usually made enough money to allow their family members to live in luxury for at least 3 generations. At the lower end of the market were textiles made in the southern part of India, in what is today Andhra Pradesh. These textiles were meant for the masses, and they were cheaper because their designs were not woven into the cloth, but were imprinted using wooden blocks. This made their production more cost and time effective. Naturally, block making itself turned into an art form, requiring skill, concentration, and creativity. There are still some villages in Andhra Pradesh which specialize exclusively in block making, descendants of those who built blocks as part of the textile trade with Southeast Asia. One of the main ways of dyeing textiles in India's east coast is the tie and dye technique, that was imported from Indonesia more than 1,000 years ago. It is a living legacy of the many ancient contacts between the two regions. Over the centuries, Indian textiles became so popular and widespread that in some areas they became a substitute for money. And Indian handlooms developed into full-fledged industries that only declined in the wake of the Industrial Revolution.
Cotton is a wonderful fiber to use for dress material. It is very comfortable to wear. It keeps out the wind. It keeps people cool when it gets very hot. But in addition to that, the Indian craftspeople had a highly developed skill of manipulating dyes. They very early on had developed indigo, and they certainly excelled in the manipulation of red dyes, for which you need to use a mordant, which is a substance that connects the dye to the fiber itself.
While India was exporting its textiles throughout Southeast Asia, it was also importing Southeast Asian silk. Producing silk is a complex process that Southeast Asians had mastered long before the Indians. It involves harvesting the silkworms, helping the cocoons to grow, and extracting the threads to produce fine fabric. Cambodia played an important role in the export of silk to India, and this farm is trying to revive the silk production traditions of its ancestors, who had traded with India centuries ago. The extent of this trade on the eastern side of the Indian Ocean, from Myanmar down to Sumatra, is often documented in stone inscriptions which describe the trade and the articles involved. The inscriptions point to the role of merchant guilds rather than of individual traders from India. The fact that most of these inscriptions are in the Pahlavi script indicates the shift in contacts to the Tamil-speaking areas of India. While Southeast Asia's early contacts with India had been with Orissa and Bengal, both strongholds of Buddhism, the shift of trade to India's southern coasts is significant because the powers of the south were Hindu, and their dominance represented Hindu revivalism in India. It was this revivalism that would be exported to Southeast Asia. One of the first Tamil kingdoms to take to the seas was the kingdom of the Pallavas. Part of their port in Mahabalipuram now lies underwater, but sufficient remains to suggest that these were devout kings bent on exporting Hinduism as much as promoting trade. The bare stone temples here contrast with the vividness of this massive bas-relief, depicting a scene from the Mahabharata, which clearly indicate that the two great Hindu myths of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana had by the 6th century AD been carefully developed. Little is known about the origins and eventual fate of the Pallava rulers, but in the second half of the first millennium they established maritime contacts with the Malay Peninsula, Java, Sumatra, and Cambodia, leaving behind Hindu temples and Tamil trading communities in all these areas. But their most lasting impact is perhaps to be found in central Vietnam, in the kingdom of Champa, which it is said was administered by Hindu councillors from India, and where the court language was Sanskrit. In the hills around Da Nang lie the single largest remains of the Champa kingdom, with Mai Son as the main urban centre. The brick structures seen here are not only vestiges of Hindu temples, but were constructed using Pallava architectural techniques. The Da Nang Museum, where most sculptures are now located, contain an amazing array of Hindu gods. Hinduism not only thrived here, it was the only religious world the Cham people knew. Yet the Cham, like most other peoples of Southeast Asia, did not copy Indian imports. Their sculptures reflect local aesthetics. The facial features, the dressing and the postures are all indigenous and not to be found in India itself. Southeast Asians developed their own variants of Hindu myths and traditions and the manners of expressing them. It is the surest sign that Hinduism had found its own destiny in this part of the world. In the 13th century, when the Cham kingdom started falling under the onslaught of the Vietnamese from the north, most of the Cham communities dispersed across the region, and today there are only a handful of them left. The Chams are now a minority, one of more than 50 such ethnic groups living in the margins of modern Vietnam. Their dark skin and thick hair are a reminder of their part Tamil ancestry. Many of the Cham who stayed behind in Vietnam converted to Islam in order to continue participating in the maritime trade that Arabs and Indian Muslims would come to dominate. Further west, in modern-day Cambodia, the big rivals of the Cham, the Khmers, were busy constructing even more impressive monuments to Hinduism and Buddhism. Many of the Khmer monuments of the fabled city of Angkor lay hidden behind dense jungle till French archaeologists uncovered them in 1860. Even today, excavation and renovation work continues, with international teams fighting both industrialization and the jungle to preserve these ruins. Many of the key sites have now been fully restored and tell an amazing tale. In the vicinity of the city of Siem Reap, between 820 and 1200 AD, the Khmers built some of the most beautiful and majestic tributes to both Hindu gods and the Buddha. The Bayon, with its multitude of smiling faces, is one of the last and most mysterious temples to be built in Angkor. Scholars to this day debate the meaning of the faces and whom they were intended to represent. What is known is that the same site served as the Mahayana Buddhist temple before being converted to a Hindu shrine. At the temple's base are a series of bas-reliefs that depict an unusual combination of mythological, historical and mundane events, including Hindus praying before a lingam and scenes from naval battles with the Cham kingdom. Barely a stone's throw from the Bayon is a temple dedicated to Brahma, which is currently being restored by the Archaeological Survey of India. This amazing combination of Hindu-Buddhist aesthetics culminated in the construction of Angkor Wat, a temple dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu. Built in the 12th century, this complex of 81 hectares consists of 5 towers, believed to represent the 5 peaks of Mount Meru, the home of the gods. Its outer walls represent the mountains enclosing the world, while the moat symbolizes the oceans beyond. Its scale is almost inconceivable. It is the world's largest single religious monument. Its outer galleries contain the longest known continuous bas-relief, illustrating stories from Hindu mythology, and particularly the Ramayana.
All these civilizations in Southeast Asia are rice cultures based on huge agrarian surplus, which had to be managed by a powerful king. To validate and legitimize the authority of the king, this epic seemed to have provided an excellent blueprint, and somehow it seems to have appealed to the imagination of these Southeast Asian kingdoms. A second, and this is a hunch that I have, a second contributory factor to the appeal of the epic seems to lie in the way the notion of ancestor worship in Southeast Asia, which is very, very popular and very persistent, found resonance with the idea of incarnation in the epic of the Ramayana. So while the theory of incarnation is not very important for the Southeast Asian kings, it seems to have clued in to the larger implications of ancestor worship, and therefore seems to have been extremely popular and found representation.
The Ramayana continues to serve as the basis of almost all classical dance and puppetry performances in Southeast Asia today. Its stories enchant viewers and offer guidance as much as they did over 1,000 years ago. But the popularity of the myths is the result of local and regional interpretations of the story that came from India. In Thailand, for example, the performances are stripped of religious significance, and Rama is presented as a Thai prince with Thai mannerisms. In Indonesia, the Ramayana incorporates local myths as well, and is most popularly expressed through the flickering lights of shadow puppetry, which were traditionally all evening affairs in villages. Using excerpts from either the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, the master puppeteer, known as the Dalang, illustrates solutions to the problems faced by the villagers and comforts them by proclaiming the certainty of eventual justice. On the island of Java, many of the shadow puppet performances were originally developed in the shadow of the impressive Prambanan complex, a few kilometres from Borobudur. The complex, whose construction began in 825 AD, was part of the generalized Hindu reaction against Buddhism in the archipelago. An influx of settlers from India into Java is perhaps a factor in the monument's construction. The complex consists of 3 main shrines dedicated to the 3 main gods of the Hindu pantheon: Brahma, Vishnu and Shiva. But the central shrine was built in veneration of the local god of the soil, in an interesting mix of foreign and indigenous religious elements. If Hindu revivalism in Southeast Asia was so extensive, it was largely due to the policies of South India's greatest maritime kingdom, that of the Cholas. The growth of the Cholas in the 9th century AD had come at the expense of the Pallavas, but from their seat of power here in the area of Tanjore, they continued the Pallava policy of trading with Southeast Asia and exporting Hinduism. And to this end, they sponsored a system of merchant guilds to promote maritime commerce on both coasts of India. To secure maritime sea routes for its merchant guilds, the Cholas also developed one of the largest navies India had ever seen. The fleet was based here in Kavaripatnam, on India's southeast coast. Today, there are no signs left of the Cholas' naval power. However, in 1025 AD, a fleet of more than 25 ships departed from this very spot to attack the kingdom of Srivijaya in Sumatra. The narrative of King Rajendra Chola's expedition to Sumatra is mentioned in the inscriptions of the Pragat Ishwar temple in Tanjore. In a matter of weeks, his naval forces had crossed the seas and destroyed the gates of Palembang, capturing the Srivijayan king and delivering the first of a series of blows that would prove fatal for the Sumatran kingdom. Never before had the Indian Ocean witnessed such a massive naval operation over such large distances.
The Cholas here probably acted to bolster the claim, the situation of the Tamil mercantile groups. This is rather, I would say once again, an exception to prove the rule that the Indians or the Asian political authorities rarely looked at the sea as an arena to establish their sovereignty, political and armed sovereignty.
An important consequence of the waning of Srivijayan power is that the centre of the maritime trade in the region shifted north to the Malay Peninsula. The new kingdom became significant not only for its strategic location, but also because it welcomed large-scale Tamil and Chinese migrants. Some of the oldest Chinese graves, such as this one in Malacca, date from this time, and the presence of Chinese traders has been continuous ever since, suggesting the rise of Chinese commercial interests in the region. In the meantime, as Hindu kingdoms grew in Java and Bali, Hinduism became firmly entrenched in both these islands. Even today, Bali remains almost entirely Hindu, reflecting the consequences of long-standing cultural contact with India.
There's never really been a time when Southeast Asians thought of themselves as being completely distinct and somehow opposition with South Asia. There's always been a feeling that there would be many mutual advantages to be acquired in all these different fields. Science was one of the main ones as well, the exchange of information, categories of knowledge even. These are things which Southeast Asians still maintain traditionally in forms which originally derived from South Asia. So the whole idea about how the world should be perceived, the categories in which we should divide up new knowledge as it comes into existence, even these things, people still are pretty aware that these derive from a period when South and Southeast Asia were one larger kind of community, intellectually as well. And economics was kind of subordinate even to ideology, to religion and politics.
At the turn of the second millennium, even as Hinduism was becoming entrenched in parts of Southeast Asia, a new force was poised to emerge: Islam, which has today transformed both Malaysia and Indonesia into two of the largest Muslim countries in the world. This is the Istiqlal Mosque in central Jakarta. This highly contemporary building is Asia's biggest mosque, a tribute to the religious traditions of a large majority of Indonesia's citizens. Yet there remains considerable debate amongst scholars as to just how Islam came into this region, which had been so overwhelmingly Buddhist and Hindu. The middle of the 7th century saw the phenomenal rise of Islam in the Arabian Peninsula. The faith united the various Arab tribes by giving them a new spiritual and civilizational foundation. Yet even before the advent of Islam, the Arabs, especially the Omanis, had long been trading peacefully with coastal India. And soon after their conversion to Islam, the merchants brought their new religion to India. The oldest known mosques in India are to be found in India's Malabar region. As coastal India's Muslim population grew, so did its role in trade with Southeast Asia. While Arab navigators had long known of the existence of Southeast Asia as a source of spices, as the map of the world drawn by the Arab Prince Idrisi clearly depicts, there is reason to believe that the first Muslim communities in Southeast Asia were not Arab, but Indian. Some of the earliest Muslim tombstones throughout the Malay and Indonesian archipelago were made for local elites who had only recently converted to Islam. For the tombstones depict Mount Meru, the home of the Hindu gods, as well as a lingam. They also depict the elephant, an animal sacred to both Hindus and Buddhists. Between 13 and 1600 AD, Hindu traditions continued to exist with Islam. Many of the early mosques in the region were Hindu temples that were simply reused as Islamic places of worship, without altering or destroying the original structure. There was no sense of discontinuity between the earlier Hindu and subsequent Islamic phases. This can be seen with the Sendang Dewur Mosque in eastern Java, which retains virtually all its Hindu architectural elements and is a heritage site in Indonesia.
The entire network of trade in the whole of Indian Ocean is Islamic. It's a fraternity, it's a brotherhood. You know, it is convenient for a trader to become a Muslim. The terms are easily done. Okay. Secondly, because Islam established a foothold politically in India, in Gujarat, in Bengal, in North India, is a power in India, the Akbar, the Mughal court. Iskandar Muda, the Achinese ruler, was imitating the Mughal court. You know, that was the model for him. So the political success of Islam in India, that also helped, and that spread along the line of Islam in Southeast Asia.
By the middle of the 15th century, Muslim merchants from Gujarat and Tamil Nadu had drawn maritime Southeast Asia into a transoceanic trading bloc that was almost entirely in Muslim hands. Yet this unity was short-lived. The Portuguese reached India at the end of the 15th century and soon were in Southeast Asia, intent on monopolizing the trade of spices. Bombing cities and using violence to extract trading concessions, the Portuguese ensured that the existing system of commerce in the Indian Ocean was dismantled. While trading links between India and Southeast Asia would continue, the era of unhindered commerce and cultural exchanges between the two regions effectively came to an end. Today, after 2 millennia of sustained commercial contacts and cultural exchanges between India and Southeast Asia, the two regions are once again at the forefront of Asia's rapid economic growth. In Southeast Asia, countries such as Singapore are already a model of prosperity and thrive on a unique blend of Asian cultures and civilizations. The contribution of the local Indian communities to this success has also played an important role in sustaining the links between the two regions. In 1967, with the creation of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or ASEAN, to consolidate the economic development and stability of the region, India today sees new opportunities for its age-old links to flourish once again. Over the years, there has been a significant rise in the volume of trade, with many goods being sent by sea, as they were centuries earlier. As India's relations with Southeast Asia begin to grow, once again free from the shackles of post-colonial trauma, their common past and shared culture will prove more than ever to be a source of mutual understanding and respect at the dawn of a new millennium.